The Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia has some of the most beautiful sights our planet has to offer. Salar means salt flat, which basically means that it's a desert, but instead of sand, it's salt. It gives you a lot of perspective, not only because you can do optical illusions like this. Delicious. It gives you perspective because of its severe emptiness. This howling crystal desert is like the world's prayer mat, smoothed out in front of you so that when you're there, it's just you and whatever higher existence you subscribe to. It was breathtaking. But the Salar de Uyuni also gives you perspective because of the desert that is surrounding it. It is filled with trash. And so, after we got out of the desert, we got into a nearby village, and I asked my guide, why don't the tourists just keep their trash and throw them away once we get into the village? I said this kind of pretentiously as I reached into my backpack, got some wrappers, and put them smugly into a trash can. And my guide, with a little bit of tragedy in her voice, said, Bolivia is too poor of a country to afford trash services for small villages. Before, indigenous people didn't need trash services, but now there are a bunch of plastic water bottle toting outsiders who don't know the difference between a salt flat and a parking lot. And the result is that this very spiritual land is becoming cluttered. I looked at my guide and said, I'm sorry, I just wasn't thinking. And that, my friends, is exactly what I want to talk to you about today. In case you've been living underneath a giant mass of plastic that's floating in our ocean, our planet's in a little bit of trouble. Our everyday decisions are fueling industries that are harming places and people in ways that will be very difficult to recover from. Think the oil industry, natural disasters caused by climate change, displacement of indigenous people, the list goes on. And so, of course, in America, the land of innovation and ideas, we turn to technology to save us. Where everyone's waiting for the next innovation of car or energy or seed genetics to dig us out of the very deep hole that we've dug ourselves into. And while that technology is important and deserves funding, I can't help but notice that we're putting a technological band-aid over what is, in fact, a spiritual deficit. I think about this a lot as a student at the School of Theology. Ask a room full of people what the most spiritually significant moment that they've ever had was. And most of them, regardless of their faith tradition, will say something in nature. Whether it is a sunrise or climbing a mountain, nature always seems to be the arena in which we encounter the holy again and again. And so, when we create a system that builds a world where those are destroyed or cluttered and made especially inaccessible to poor people, I can't help but notice that we have a problem that is much deeper than oil spills, that requires a solution much greater than the next generation of solar panels. It reminds me of my insomniac friend. He's really tired, but he's so tired that he can't get to sleep. Therefore, his original deficit is driving him farther and farther away from health. And so, when I look at this recent crescendo of environmental destruction that is driving us farther and farther away from global health, I can't help but connect it back to an original spiritual deficit. Deep down, we all know at the core of human beings is an interconnectedness to all things, especially living things. None of our actions exist in a vacuum. We affect beings. Beings affect us. However, when we dominate and exploit land, we develop a societal callousness that allows us to forget that our actions have real effects on human beings and those precious places where we encounter the holy. And so, I drink cheap coffee, and workers in Bolivia have to cut down trees like this, which, along with being 600 years old, is where the indigenous people believe the spirits live. I use energy from coal, and communities in the US start getting cancer because they're drinking from rivers polluted by the coal industry. And I don't mean to be alarmist, and I would never posit that we could live in this world without affecting anything. But that's not really my issue. My issue is one of mindfulness. Whether or not the coffee trade is ever going to be perfect, if we're causing human suffering from our consumption, we should remember that every time we consume. And the same is true for when we eat food, or use energy, or throw away wrappers. But it's okay. We can breathe. Because along with having to keep track of the destruction in our world, we also have to have a rich appreciation for the beauty all around us. We kind of miss the point if we're so involved in preventing harm that we don't savor the wonder around us. And so, now is a good time to remember that technology can save us. But I'm not talking about the engineering type of technology, which, in case you haven't been listening to the talk, is really important and deserves funding. Seriously. I'm talking about the spiritual technology that humanity has been developing for millennia. Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, writes about when he first came into a monastery, he had to memorize a series of sayings called gathas, which he repeated every time that he did an everyday task. And so, for example, whenever he would wash his hands, he would say, "Water flows over these hands. May I use them skillfully to preserve our precious planet." And likewise, whenever he would open a door, gatha. Go for a walk, gatha. Take a poop. There's a gatha for that too. The whole point is that if you take a half second more to notice these everyday things, these seemingly redundant things, you see them for what they really are, which is an absolutely unique event. The water that is pouring over your hands is different from the water from the last time you washed your hands. That door has changed since you last opened it. And slowly, as you add gathas throughout your entire life, mindfulness starts to set in. And this is only a Buddhist example. There are certainly, within Christianity, my own tradition, there are certainly practices that focus on mindfulness and centering, as well as most world religions and philosophies. And so, in light of the environmental mess that we're in right now, why not teach a new dog old tricks? Why not use ancient mindfulness? Why not use ancient mindfulness practices to save us from ourselves and the environmental mess that we created? And this idea is kind of fun because there's so many directions you can take it. Here are some adaptations that I've used of ancient practices applied to our contemporary situation. A lot of people say grace before meals. So why not say grace every time you throw something away? Why not, when you're waiting for the bus on the park bench, take note of every living thing around you? And when you're about to eat, why not meditate over the ingredients list? But be careful, because once you start to do that, you realize that half the ingredients on that list are not real English words. And you start to notice that your body doesn't like the taste of chemicals. And be careful, because if you keep doing this, you might just start to eat a little simpler. And if you keep up with these practices, and it is a lot of work, a lot of persistence, you start to simplify your entire life. Your existence starts to declutter when the only moment you're living in is the present one. And when you can step outside and see the sky and really see the sky, or when you can wash your hands and really feel the water, or sit in an auditorium and really breathe the air, life becomes so flavorful. And soon, you can't help but let gratitude come in. I'm excited to be presenting this to you today because our generation is especially fit to include mindfulness practices into our lives. We have more access to information about food and energy than our parents' generation ever did. And movements like the fair trade movement and the organic foods movement and the local foods movement aren't perfect, but they're showing that the market is angling towards caring about human beings again. We are especially fit to be mindful, which is great because along with being an informed generation, we are an anxious people. Let me take a poll. Raise your hand if you or a friend has a hard time getting to sleep at night. Raise your hand if you or a friend has a hard time staying focused in a conversation, even if that conversation is important. You see their eyes going all over. Raise your hand if you or a friend has had a panic attack in the past school year. We are a nervous people. We are a nervous people in a stunningly open and a spiritual world. The question is whether we will calm down enough to realize it. There is an epilogue. While researching for this talk, I found a lot of articles and speeches and TED Talks that had some bad news to share. It's too late. It's too late. Human action has put our planet on a trajectory of destruction that will be unable to support human life. And it doesn't matter how many petitions we have, how much science, how much prayer. It's too late. And I want to pause and take an inventory for how you're feeling. Are you panicking? Are you distancing yourself from the problem and minimalizing it? Or are you so angry that you're going to put together a slideshow and say a TED Talk about it? That's fine, but these three are the exact same way that the rest of the world is responding when we're realizing that we're polluting ourselves out of existence. And from that panic will inevitably come a grab for the few resources that remain, will inevitably be a victimization of the defenseless and poor people. And so, in light of this news, I don't think my TED Talk changes any. Crises are the exact moments when mindfulness practices are most important. The temptation to forget our interconnectedness becomes more seductive the more panicked we get. But if we are to persist as a species, it will only be by sticking together. And we'll only be able to do that if we start practicing now. And so, it is our decision when we want peace and gratitude to be in our lives. And when we do, our world we'll be able to look at our world so honestly like it was the first time. Thank you.